Hey guys, it's Alex. I'm sure you guessed this video was coming after the last one, but today I'm going to be talking about my top 5 least favorite sequels. Last week I went through some of my favorite sequels, and I actually have some sequels in this list that are by the same author as those sequels, or even in the same series as those sequels. And I don't have many of these books as they are least favorites, so I'm just gonna have to insert the cover over here somewhere. The first sequel I have to talk about is Hidden Bodies by Carolyn Kepnes. This is a sequel to You. I really loved You. I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was a fantastic thriller. I thought it had a very unique voice. It was a thriller about stalking from the point of view of the stalker instead of the victim. And I thought the way she humanized him and the way the book was written to the victim from the stalker's point of view was incredibly well done and very interesting. Hidden Bodies had none of that. Where You was unique and interesting and compelling, Hidden Bodies was just weird and unnecessary. I honestly believe this book wasn't intended as a sequel originally. It felt like a completely different character. It felt like the events from the previous book hadn't happened except for a few times they were just mentioned. Like, this was intended to be a completely different book, and then since You was so popular, she turned it into a sequel. It also didn't have the voice of the first book. You was written to the victim, to Bex. Every thought he had was written to Bex, to You, and it was very compelling to read that. Hidden Bodies didn't have that, and it's hard to have a sequel that just completely changes everything about the book. I thought it was weird. I thought it was unnecessary and long and boring. I didn't like the awkward sex scenes that were all about blueberries. It was like, maybe if you have a blueberry fetish, that would appeal to you, but it was like really unappealing and gross to read about. And I gave that book 2 stars, and it was such a letdown after You. The second book I have to talk about, I actually have a physical copy of, and that is The Crow by Alison Croggon. This is the 3rd book in the Books of Pelennor. I had the 2nd book of the Books of Pelennor on my list last week as one of my favorite sequels. This book is well written. It's a good book. My problem with it is that the other 3 books in the series center around Mayrad. Mayrad is the main character. She is in a prophecy that she's going to defeat the Nameless One, and the other 3 books are solely about her. This book doesn't even have Mayrad in it. This book has her younger brother in it. It's not a bad book, it's just when I read this, it has important information to the story. It's a good book, I just don't care because it's not about any of the characters I care about. The characters in this were 2 minor characters from a previous book, and none of the other characters that we know are in this book. Mayrad's not in it at all. Her mentor's not in it at all. And it's just a struggle for me to get through it. I have read every other book in the series at least twice because I really love this quartet. The Books of Pelennor are so good. They're just so wonderful. But this book I've only read once. It's not something you can skip because it is so important to the story. And it is an interesting book. It's just, after reading the naming, which I enjoy, and the riddle, which I love, to just leave those characters behind for the 3rd book and focus on someone who hasn't been important before getting the climax to Mayrad's story. It was a letdown of a 3rd book for me. The next book I have on this list is Winter by Marissa Myers. I really enjoyed Cinder. Cinder was my favorite book of the series. I gave it 4 stars, and I was surprised at how well done it was. Scarlet and Cress I didn't love quite as much, but I still enjoyed those books. Winter I didn't like. I gave Winter 2 stars. I found it unnecessarily long. That was my biggest problem with Winter. Whereas Cinder was significantly shorter and it felt like it went along with the plot as it should. Winter felt like we were rehashing the same plot over and over and over again. I felt that book could have been half its length without actually losing any of the necessary plot, and that book was, I think, 800 pages long or somewhere around there. I still did care about the characters and their stories, but so much of that plot just centered around the characters breaking up and then being reunited and then being broken up again. And they were constantly trying to stick together and just couldn't. And that got very old very quickly for me. And a couple of 100 pages into the book, I just didn't want to deal with it anymore. I don't think it was a terrible book. It just needed to be cut down by a few hundred pages. And it's still the Newt's Readathon, so of course I included a Harry Potter book in this list. This thing. I'm maybe stretching the definition of sequel a bit here by including this book on this list, but it's close enough. It does say the 8th story on the back, so I'm counting it. I don't mind that this book is a play, because I have read screenplays or scripts before and enjoyed them. I love Shakespeare, I love reading them, and I can, like, just focus on the story and not the medium. However, this story was not Harry Potter. I think I would not necessarily hate the story as much as I do were it not Harry Potter. Like, it's decently written. It just feels like fan fiction. It's not the same characters. We've watched them go through so much growth and development throughout the 7 books that we know them really well. It feels like Jack Thorne doesn't know them as well as we do, or not nearly as well as J.K. Rowling does. I was so excited for this, and I read it, and I think I gave it 4 stars, but I'm gonna be honest, 2 of those stars were probably just because it is Harry Potter, and Harry Potter always gets a couple of stars just for being Harry Potter. But I really don't recommend this book. Like, even if you're a huge Harry Potter fan, just give this one a miss. Like, maybe if you can see it performed, that would be worth it, just because it would be an amazing performance to see. But reading this book is not worth it. The way Harry treats his son in this is not something Harry would ever do. Not the Harry that we have grown to know and love. It just read like really bad fan fiction. And there's some good fanfic out there that's a lot better than this. So, like, if you're curious about this, just, like, go read some Harry Potter fanfics. There's some good stuff. It's not this. For this final one, I'm going to make it kind of a 2-parter. So I'll be talking about 2 books here, but they're 2 books in the same series, so I figure it all counts as one. The book I have on my shelf is Bloodhound by Tamora Pierce, which is the 2nd book in the Becca Cooper series. I've included Tamora Pierce in my list before. I love Tamora Pierce. She's one of my favorite writers. I loved the first book in this series. I thought Terrier was fantastic. I was so excited when I read it for the first time and realized it was going to be a new trilogy, because Terrier was a great book. And then she released Bloodhound, which is the one I own, and I just bought it because it's Tamora Pierce, and I was like, oh, it's going to be amazing. And I read it, and I didn't hate it, but it was definitely a disappointment. This book alone is not bad enough to be on this list, but I'll get to that in a minute. This book reads like a police procedural, and I do enjoy police procedurals to an extent, but Tamora Pierce writes books about adventures and fantasy and women fighting against the government and sexism and all of those wonderful things. She doesn't do her best work at police procedurals. Terrier is about the police of this world, but it had so much adventure and excitement that it was just a fantasy adventure novel. This was a police procedural, first and foremost. It dragged. It was boring. I was not as invested in this as I wanted to be. But again, I think I gave it 3 stars and it was fine. And I was still very excited to read the 3rd book in this trilogy. And that is the book that is actually on this list. That is Mastiff, still by Tamora Pierce, obviously. Mastiff was not what I wanted. Mastiff felt wrong, and I don't know how to explain how wrong it felt without just sounding like a reader who didn't get what she wanted from a book, because it wasn't that. Mastiff just felt out of character for most of the characters in this story. It felt like the big climax came out of nowhere. It ruined a lot of characters for me, and it ruined the story. It's honestly to the point where I just pretend Bloodhound and Mastiff don't exist and Terrier is a standalone novel, because it kind of works. And I can't talk specifics about what I didn't like, because that would be spoilers, but it did have many of the same qualities of Bloodhound that I had issues with. It felt very much like a police procedural. It felt very dry and very long and very drawn out. It didn't have a lot of the fun or the adventure or the reasons that I read fantasy. And then it had characters who weren't acting like how they'd been developed in the previous 2 books. I'm not sure if I gave this 2 stars or 1 star, but it made me so angry, and it's made me afraid to read more Tamora Pierce in the future, because I'm afraid that she will ruin more characters for me. And I haven't read her newest book because of that. I just stick with her old stuff. I think Mastiff was actually the worst sequel that I have ever read, because I did love the first book so much, and Mastiff was such a letdown for me. Let me know down below what some of the worst sequels you guys have ever read are, and let me know if you've read any of the books on my list, and let me know how wrong I am if you love them. I'd be interested to see a differing viewpoint. As always, thank you for commenting and watching, and I will talk to you guys again soon. Bye!